We've talked already this morning about commitments that national governments have been making. And so we wanted to have a follow-up discussion to discuss the state of play in the world of business. Over 40 countries have now put in place a price on carbon. Global companies have announced very ambitious commitments for 2030 in the last year. But accountability for these commitments will have political, economic, social, and legal ramifications. So what will it take to deliver them on a global scale? What kind of mobilization is needed across all our sectors to trigger real change? Crucially, how can this pace be successfully sustained and justly maintained to inspire businesses in other regions across the world? We'll have about 30 minutes to cover this session, and I'm joined by two astounding guests. And I would like to invite first Jesper Brodin, who's the CEO of Ingka Group, previously known as IKEA Group, to the stage. Yeah, just over the side. And Laura Clarke, the CEO of ClientEarth. Just a reminder to everybody in the audience that if you have questions for the panelists, please put them in the note cards, and we will take a session at some point, your questions at some point during the session. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Jesper, for joining me. And I wanted to start with you, Jesper. We've seen many companies make commitments, particularly over the past few years, around the goals for reducing emissions. And I wanted to just ask, how is IKEA doing this? What is your company's strategy in terms of making sure that these are actually achieved?
Very good. Thank you. Is that my noise or is it? Yeah?
I think it is.
Okay. So first of all, thank you for this incredible opening. I think the storytelling and bring the things we love into the room is so important. So IKEA is, I don't know, many people don't know, we are actually foundation-based. So we are entirely owned by a foundation called IKEA Foundation, which means that since the 80s, we have a structure where basically, a very interesting structure because as many people would say that business's purpose is making money, there might be some who see things like that. So our purpose and our vision has been since long to create a better life for people. And we do that predominantly, of course, by making home furnishing and life at home affordable for people in a sustainable, people and planet positive way. Then we are part of the structure, so basically any dividends would go to the foundation, who is here presently, of course, at the COP as well, working with the same themes, people and planet positive areas. So in that structure, you could say that our foundation works a lot today with adaptation, partly mitigation as well. But maybe what I find the most important part of our contribution to this topic, we were early out. We had an internal process already in the beginning of the 2000s, and we jumped on the train when the Paris Climate Agreement came about. So we are probably one of the first big companies and value chains who presented a Scope 3 plan, which is for those who is not into the technical terms, it's not only about our buildings and our own premises, but it's really about our entire value chain from end to end. So we are committed to be climate positive by 2030, which is then, in the initial model, is both our own footprint and then carbon capturing. It's an incredibly interesting work, very difficult, very technical. But it means that we're addressing everything from raw materials, transportation, production, retailing, but also the product life cycle in life at home and customers. And if I would say, I think one of the most important things that I've learned over the years is that this is, of course, right for all the ethical and moral reasons. It's, of course, very smart from a brand positioning point of view, and if you want to attract the best coworkers. But what people tend to have a misconception, I think, is about this is the only way we can survive as a business. So serving the many people within wallets, the old consumption model of the 1900s is not going to be economically smart, not only in the future, already today. So we are in a hurry to get into the new economic model so that we can actually continue to exist as a company. And I have loads of examples that I'm happy to share at a later moment on that. But I'll stop there.
You know, I was just going to ask you, like, could you talk a little bit about, like, just tease out a little bit, like, you know, you talk about the difficult process of, like, getting to this place. Could you tease out that a little bit and give us some examples?
But I can think, and we're also disclosing the whole plan, if you like. So you can say, on the list of what we have done, we already have reduced food waste by half. We saved 26 million portions per year. This is a SDG goal for 2030 that we already delivered. We are at scope 1 and 2 energy, renewable energy investments at 130%. So most of our store have solar panels on the roof, and we have put in 3.1 billion euro in wind and solar across the world. We are connecting it to our supply chain. I think we're at 60% in production renewable energy, which is not bad. We have come to 56% renewable material in our total product line, 56% renewable, and 17% recycled. So we are pacing, and you can say almost so far, none of this is bad for business, bad for economies. Transportation, electric vehicles, we struggle because it's infrastructure complicated, but we already have big cities where we deliver everything in IKEA, 100% electrical. Veggie balls, plant balls, LED lighting, many examples of how we play across the value chain. And I'm, of course, happy also to share maybe later in our conversation where we're stuck and where we struggle, because we still have a couple of really big things to tackle ahead of us. But it's working.
Fantastic. Laura, with ClientEarth, like you're using the law, you're looking at the law and how it can bring systemic change and particularly hold companies accountable. Could you talk a little bit about that and what your process has been like?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And first of all, really interesting to hear about your work in IKEA. And of course, I speak as someone for whom IKEA has been a very big part of my life, particularly my 20s and 30s, as most people do. And I think the first thing to say is it's not easy. These net zero commitments and environmental commitments for companies, it's not easy to do, as Jesper says. And what ClientEarth tries to do is use the law to support and advise companies in how they can make meaningful net zero commitments and strategies that are 1.5 degrees aligned, and how they need to be absolutely integrated in the core of the operation. So not cosmetic, not part of the PR department, but absolutely core to how you operate. And so as ClientEarth, we've provided guidance on what a really good net zero strategy looks like, what it needs to involve in terms of it being science-based and reasonable with the right targets, covering the 3 scopes of emissions, so everything across supply chains, but also they need to be transparent and accountable. So we provide that guidance. We provide guidance also on the legal responsibilities of directors, for example. But what we can also do using the law is hold companies to account. So when they are not, should I just move this a bit? Yeah. There, I'm getting a lot of feedback. That's better. So when companies are not delivering on their commitments, when they are saying that they're doing the right thing, but actually they're not, what we can do, should we use this instead? What we can do is use litigation to make an example of these companies. And so I will talk about 2 broad areas that we use. One is tackling greenwashing. And greenwashing is essentially when a company says it's doing the right thing, but actually isn't. It's using advertising and PR, but in fact it's carrying on as normal. How's that? Oh, that's
Much better.
So, sorry, it was just sounding so horrible for me.
Yeah.
That's better. So we take action against companies that say we are doing the right thing, but in fact they're not. In the core of their operation, they're not. It's really a PR exercise, and it's not integrated into their activity, into their operations, their strategy, and every way they operate. So we launched in 2019 our greenwashing files, highlighting 9 companies that are doing this greenwashing and essentially misleading the public, misleading consumers, and what that does, of course, is it delays climate action. And our first case was against BP, which was, through all its advertising, was implying that it was investing enormously in low-carbon energy, when in fact 96% of its operation was still about fossil fuels. So we took a complaint to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development under their guidelines on the way businesses operate, and BP then withdrew its advertising, and the CEO said it would no longer do that sort of reputational advertising. And so that was one case. We have another case against Total Energies in France, which again highlights the fact that what it says about its operation is not consistent with the emissions that it is responsible for as a result of its fossil fuel infrastructure. We have a case against Glencore, which is a coal company in Australia, and also one against KLM, the airline, saying where it's advertising about sustainable flying is essentially misleading customers into thinking it's easy, it's not a problem to fly, and that flying is sustainable. I mean, or rather, it misleads to say that actually they are decarbonizing faster than they actually are. And I think the big point about these greenwashing cases is it makes an example of companies, and therefore what it does is it encourages those who are doing the right thing to double down on that, to keep doing the right thing, and it makes an example of those who are essentially trying to work the system and cheat. And I think that's one of the areas where litigation can be powerful.
Okay. I want to just follow that question to Jesper, and from a business perspective, what are some of the difficulties in terms of like putting in place some of these or enforcing some of these regulations and laws and actually following them through that Laura is talking about?
I think incredibly important work that you're doing, and I think it has two sides really. You can say, to start with, I just applaud what you're doing to set things right, and I think again to bring bring illusions to the public in this topic is of course something that needs to be rooted out. And at the same time, I think it's incredibly important that we parallel make sure we set the rules for how we want more of the right type of communication. So in our data, for instance, we do a globe scan review by and large, and we talk to 30,000 people in 30 markets. And we see that the concern for climate change is a global thing. It's quite little differences from market to market globally. And when you go younger, the concern and the worry goes higher, but it's above 70% in any market that we are active. Then you ask people, in what way do you see yourself as part of the solution? It's only 6-7%, it's rising, but that gap, I think, is a democratic issue that can drive cynicism and all sorts of bad things. Interesting enough, if you ask people, are you prepared to pay for something that is right, only 4% of the IKEA consumers says yes. And I know for a fact, since I meet people in their homes, single mothers, etc. So it's not an arrogant or ignorant topic. They simply don't have the money. So my first job and our first job is, of course, to provide solutions that are scalable and affordable and not contra economics. Secondly, my job is to tell the story. So we need to tell people the real substantiate the story with the rules that organizations like yourself are proposing, not to be afraid of being scrutinized and criticized. If you have the right intentions and if you have substance behind the claims, my view is that it's your job to communicate, to fill that gap in society. And I'm happy to be challenged on that point. That's my view.
Okay. Laura, do you want to respond to that and maybe just tease out a little bit why some of these companies are not abiding to these rules and regulations, and how you sort of like this conversation that you're having with them, whether it's through actually suing them or talking to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a mix, isn't it, of it being very hard, so companies having the right intent but not quite getting it right, and the other is about essentially what we're trying to do and what we need to do in this time of crisis is reconceptualize value. So we're not just looking at what is on the bottom line, what is your short-term return for your shareholder, ignoring the impact on the environment, ignoring your greenhouse gas emissions, ignoring what happens in your supply chain. And so, for me, I think for us as ClientEarth, the trick is differentiating between those who are not actually doing the right thing and greenwashing, and those that are genuinely making the best effort but need support. Because let's face it, this is very new. We're kind of building the aeroplane and flying it at the same time in terms of these responsibilities. And I think, one of the things that we've done also is talk about, is focus on the fiduciary duties of boards of directors through some of our litigation. And we've had 2 shareholder action cases which have been, or we've had one and we've got one underway, which have been quite significant. One was in Poland, where as shareholders in an energy company called Enea, we argued that a new coal-fired power station was not in the interests of the company and its shareholders and its long-term viability. And we said this coal plant is going to be a stranded asset, meaning that, very shortly down the road you will have invested in something that is no longer a viable concern. And the court agreed, and the coal plant couldn't go ahead. And the day of the court's judgment, the shareholder the shareholder value increased. So the value of the shares increased because essentially the market agreed that investing in coal wasn't the right thing. So we're getting to the right place in this. And we've currently got a shareholder case. As shareholders in Shell, we have a shareholder case against Shell essentially saying that their lack of a very transparent and fully functioning climate strategy is a breach of their fiduciary duties under the UK Companies Act, essentially that it is not in the long-term interests of the shareholders and the long-term sustainability of Shell as an operation to not have that fully operational climate strategy. And we're doing that very much in the best interests of Shell and its shareholders and thinking about the wider environmental and climate context. And we're also inviting institutional investors to join us in that because, again, it's about making sure that directors, boards of directors think about value in the most holistic way and think about long-term sustainability, and that short-term return for shareholders is only one small element of it.
Thank you. Just a quick reminder that for the audience that we will take questions soon. So just write them with the note cards and the runners will come around taking them. Jesper, I want to ask you, you mentioned earlier on in the conversation that, how Ingka was now owned by a nonprofit. And I wanted to just have you reflect a little bit on how that ownership structure has played a role and encouraged.
Sorry, could you come again?
The question? Yes. In terms of just how the ownership structure of the company has sort of impacted, the company sort of sticking to these rules and regulations and.
You mean the financial structure?
Yes.
Okay. No, I think one of the interesting topics right now is that we're dealing with a mid-long-term aspect of change, and short-termness is, of course, an enemy to that, both from a political point of view and from a corporate point of view. So I think a lot of corporate leaders like myself look into how do we actually drive sustainable change for the future? Because it's not about adapting a little bit, it's about transformation of business models that we talk about. It requires investments, it requires long-term belief in strategy. And I would say the CEOs that are in the forefront of that transition have in common that you need, to a certain degree, take a leap of faith. You can't have all the answers, which we tend to like to have in our business plans. So you need to build it on a strong belief. You need to take some risks. But on the contrary, more and more people realize that not taking that leap is the biggest risk you can take. So if you look at where we're headed, not only with the disastrous impact of climate change, but the economical impacts of taxation, of brand loss, and all sorts of damages, including that you're not part of harvesting the new cost opportunities. A lot of people, I don't think, have understood that the old model might have been based economically on low cost of labor, low cost of raw material. The new model is already here, and it's based on low cost of renewable energy and low cost of rematerial. Then you have a number of system shifts that we stand before that are happening but haven't fully happened or haven't almost begun to happen. So I think these barriers are where we struggle a little bit at the moment to get the full impact of the change. I have no clue if I answered your question or not.
Yes, and
sort of.
Yes, and I want to follow up with a question on balancing both the provision of affordable products with also high volume sales, and how that impacts the environment. If within this process, like, how do you think about that?
It's both, I think, a dilemma and a myth in a way, because if you turn it around, so we discuss consumption a lot, and we're part of looking into how do we redefine consumption as such. And then you can say, in IKEA's customer base, it's not necessarily people with a lot of money who go for luxury. It's people who save money for a bunk bed for the kids. It's people who need a new sofa. It's basic needs in life at home normally. But affordability is the only way we can do this. We can only resolve climate change and nature-related issues by making it affordable. Because the opposite would be that people should pay a premium means it's only rich people who can afford the future, and how would that work? So I think, again, we are, and this is of course not an easy topic, but the opposite would be impossible. But I can give you a couple of examples, because if I give you one of our biggest footprints from a...
Could you just hold the mic a little bit higher?
Okay, sorry, thank you. So one of the product categories that has a big carbon footprint in our line of business is mattresses. And I give you some interesting numbers on it, because you can of course say a mattress lasts for approximately 10 years, wherever you go, whatever brand, that's about what its life length is. So first of all, you want to make the mattresses last for longer. But if you make them last for 14 years or 16 years, you still have at the core a consumption issue. And people will not stop sleeping, so you need to resolve that topic. So again, second-hand, prolongation, qualities is good strategies to resolve it, but you need to address the core of the problem. And if I take Netherlands as an example, where we have started a very interesting project. So we have a population of 70 million, so actually, in fact, it's about 1.5 million mattresses go to incineration every year. Only Netherlands, 1.5 million mattresses, if you can imagine. So what has happened in collaboration with the Dutch government, they have removed subsidies on incineration, which was put in place logically to avoid landfill a long time ago. They removed that, they put in legislation to make sure that mattresses need to be brought back to collection points. We have now, with a couple of other entrepreneurs, set up 4 units to bring back mattresses. We don't only bring back IKEA's market share, so we have capacity for every mattress in Netherlands, every mattress. And we take back, separate the materials in 3 categories, sell it back circular back into the value chain. And it's not the most impressive business I ever set up, but it's making profit. So there you have, again, circularity and the system shifts that I talk about that requires government and corporate shifts is actually helping us to produce a more affordable product that is then sustainable. This is one example. So we have a lot of things that we haven't resolved yet, but it's at least one that shows a good way.
Those are very quite detailed promises and processes. Laura, for companies and governments that do not have detailed processes like this, what's the value for them to follow these commitments, and how can they sort of like begin even to have this conversation?
So I think the value is increasingly this will be something that it affects reputations and therefore viability of companies, and it makes sense therefore in that business in terms of the viability of the business. It's also about recognizing the very, very real impacts of climate-related risk on terms of the future sustainability of your company. And so it's incredibly important that companies are accounting for that and trying to mitigate it. And I think, just listening to that story about the mattresses and that innovation there, really what companies need to be doing is incentivizing their teams, their directors, but others to think about how do you make this change real. So you need to have a strategy that is absolutely Paris aligned, but you then need the culture within the organization so that individuals are rewarded and compensated. And remuneration needs to be linked to accountability of delivering these sustainability changes, and that's really important. We've always had remuneration linked to increasing profits in the oil and gas sector. Of course, it's about how much oil and gas you can sell, but actually in this age, it needs to be linked to what innovations can you have that actually make our business sustainable, aligned with net zero, that doesn't pass on the costs to the consumer, because that's incredibly important, and essentially, works across the operation. And that needs to be the responsibility of the board, of the directors, the CEO and the board of directors, but it also needs to be incentivized throughout an organization.
We'll take a couple more questions, and just a reminder that you put your questions in the note cards and raise your hand so that the runners can take. We have a question from Rukia in the audience. Could you just stand up so that the mic person could get to you? There you go.
Hi, my question is, don't you think greenwashing is actually happening places like COP? And what can we do to overcome that? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take one more from Fareed. There you go.
Thank you so much. The topic or the issue of governance in developing countries is such a huge issue. So what's the role of governance and how important it is to help with greenwashing and corporate greenwashing specifically? Thank you.
Could you just repeat the question?
What is the role and importance of governance, especially in developing countries, which significantly is lacked, in combating greenwashing and corporate greenwashing in general?
So government and
Governance, yeah.
Do you want to?
Great, thank you. So I think we absolutely need the right, you do need the right regulatory and legislative frameworks in place. And I think part of the problem with this issue is because it is so new, we don't necessarily have that. And so companies are trying to sort of, work it out as they go along. So having the right frameworks in place. So for example, the EU is doing a lot of work on consumer protections, which will make it much harder to do greenwashing. And so really making sure the right regulations are in place in terms of best practice from corporates is very important. And also the sort of regulations on unfair, on misleading advertising. Now, there often is the right legislation in place that regulates advertising. You just need to find the right angle on it. It's about looking at consumer protection legislation, for example. So in different jurisdictions, you need to find your different vehicles for coming after these things. But of course, it's not ideal because actually it shouldn't be happening in the first place. But that's why ClientEarth does its work. Yes, there's greenwashing happens everywhere. There's greenwashing at COP27. I think all of us felt rather sad when we saw that it was being sponsored by Coca-Cola with its, massive amounts of plastic. And one of the, and that links, I suppose, to some work that we've done with ClientEarth on plastics, where recently under the French law of diligence, we have put big food companies on notice for the plastic that they have in their operations. And we've basically written to them saying, you need to deplastify, otherwise we will take you to court. And that's under this French legislation that says that companies have to account every year for all the environmental and human rights impacts across their operations, and they need to do a report each year. And most of these companies, and I'm talking about McDonald's and Nestle and Danone, most of these companies are not accounting for the plastic that is used across their operations. And so we do need to go after plastics, because plastics, of course, is sometimes described as big oil's plan B, because it is sustaining that industry. Of course, when plastic breaks down, it releases emissions, and we all know about the massive problems of plastic pollution, so it is a real issue.
No, I just, I think, no, I'm just sitting with the question to you actually, and that is to the point, as you said, legislation is not in place yet, but it's moving, and you probably are one of the most knowledgeable persons who knows. And I was thinking maybe to invite myself with other corporates to maybe to a workshop to, if you want to be ahead of the game in anticipation of what type of legislation will come. And I know that we are and other companies are working with experts to try to figure it out. But it could be maybe a way for us to align a little bit on what good looks like. Yeah.
I think that would be excellent because, we don't,
Fabulous.
our ideal is that we're not litigating, right? Our ideal is that companies know what they need to do, that they get it right, and litigation is always a last resort, and actually working together and having, a clearer plan so that then, you're essentially, first of all, you're changing what you do because you know your responsibilities and the legal risk, but then you actually affect cultural change, right, in terms of just how people think and operate. And so I think that would be fantastic. Yeah.
Jesper, just to follow on Laura's point, I think the issue that is coming out here is the question of trust and why consumers, particularly in light of this issue of greenwashing and the fact that the companies set out commitments and then they don't follow through. How do you build trust? Why should consumers find a way to trust you, or you make sure that they are trustworthy of your products? And
so we are quite well off when it comes to building trust, and I think again it could be seen as a brand building exercise, but I think it's about something bigger and more important than that. It's an interesting one because I think my view is the only reason for people to trust us is through our actions and through the result that we present. But I think in this case also, I think since climate change is such a complex topic, I think there should be a small amount also where people look at organizations to look at the intentions. It's harder to judge. You have to, that's part of the game of trust, right? That you have to take a leap of faith also in that respect. But that means that sometimes I think we need to prepare ourselves as consumers and citizens to trust good intentions, because it takes a bit of time to get through. Maybe even trust people for their failures, because we will fail with some parts of the way. But ultimately, the only way we will be trusted by consumers, by co-workers, by society is by the actions that we put in place and the results that we produce. Thereby, it ties back to the responsibility to communicate it. Otherwise, how can we build trust?
There's an audience question from Hashay, and I think it's for you, Laura. It says, in your view, what is the power of shareholders in driving corporate transformation? How can their influence be harnessed for greater ambition and deeper accountability?
I think it's a really interesting topic, and I think it's going to be a growing trend, actually, of shareholders being much more active, thinking about, is the organization, is the company doing the right thing, and if not, taking this action and thinking about that long-term sustainability, thinking about the climate-related risk, and being more active, and that can be through shareholder actions like the ones I've described, so the one that we had in Poland or the one against Shell, but it can be in other ways as well, of course, because shareholders can write, they can pressure, they can use their leverage as investors to affect the change they want to see. And it goes not just to the sort of strategy that it is being set at a company level in terms of the operations, but it should also speak to, well, what is this company doing beyond what it's doing in terms of its net zero commitments and its strategy? What is it doing in terms of lobbying? Who is it lobbying behind closed doors? And is that aligned with what we're trying to see? And so really trying to lift up the bonnet of the car, if you like, and see what's going on underneath and ask those questions. And we're supporting an action against Volkswagen, which is about saying, what is Volkswagen? With the investors have been trying to get Volkswagen to disclose what they're doing in terms of their private lobbying, and that hasn't been forthcoming. And so they're going to court to try to get that information, because you have to be thinking both about what you're doing as an organization and your impact, but also what sort of change are you advocating for in the outside world, because you can't do one thing on this side and then something totally different on the other.
I understand that Hashe wanted to ask the question and might have a follow-up. Do you want to get him a mic? He or she a mic? Could you just stand up so that they can get you a microphone? Hashe? Yeah. No?
Somebody shy?
Yeah. You don't have to be shy. Yeah. Yes, that's, are you Hashi?
Hi, sorry, it's Hashim. There's an M at the part.
Okay.
Sorry. But yeah, my question was more around the accountability part. I know in that BP story you talked about how when they got sued, they retracted the statement. But is there another step to that where instead there's actually a financial penalty for them, where they ultimately benefit from putting out these false claims that are not substantiated, and I guess the worst impact for them is like a slap on the wrist and them making it go back, right? Like retracting that statement. Like what would be the next steps, I guess, to having bigger repercussions for people who put out these false claims that are not substantiated?
I mean, I think I'm going to give a slightly boring answer, which I think it depends on the jurisdiction, where you're bringing the case or the claim, and therefore what remedies are available. And so I think it would depend, maybe. And this actually didn't get to court because it was a complaint to the OECD, but it was clear that there was enough in it. If they hadn't withdrawn, there was enough in it to take it further. But other cases do go to court, and I think then it depends on the jurisdiction and whether the court decides that what the remedy is, if it's found to be a case. Should it just be a change to the advertising approach? Should there be some form of compensation? I think it's quite hard to sort of. Sorry, that's a rather boring answer, but yeah.
Well, thank you, Hashim. Appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you to Jesper. Thank you, Laura. I really enjoyed this conversation.